And I want to thank our witnesses for offering their expertise, and a thank you to you for holding this important hearing. It has been nearly a year since the invasion of the Ukraine, and the ongoing war has brought the U.S. and our allies together in a series of unprecedented economic sanctions against Russia. This offers a glimpse at what the international response might be in case of Chinese aggression against Taiwan. Mr. Lorber, could you describe the lessons the Chinese have learned from the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how China is responding to protect itself from potential sanctions?
Thank you, sir. I appreciate the question. I can't describe the specific Chinese response to what the Russia sanctions campaign looked like, but I can say that a few lessons that came out of the Russian invasion and the associated U.S. response are particularly noteworthy. One is that, to the Biden administration's credit, they did put together a very expansive multilateral campaign that has, over time, done significant damage, I think, to the Russian economy. Maybe not as much as folks wanted it to for a variety of reasons, but has done significant damage and degraded its military capability. At the same time, however, I think it's fairly widely understood and fairly obvious that the threat of Russia sanctions in the lead up to the Russian invasion were insufficient to deter the Russian decision. And so I think that, at least in terms of when thinking about an aggressive, massive sanctions campaign in any scenario, those two principles need to be kept in mind. One, yes, they can be impactful in terms of hurting an adversary's economy, but two, they may not change that adversary's decision-making.
Fair point. Chinese state-owned banks are used to expand China's One Belt and One Road initiative and regularly saddle unsustainable debts on developing countries. For example, the Export-Import Bank of China and the Chinese Development Bank have lent billions of dollars to Sri Lanka, which faces, of course, a debt crisis with no end in sight. African nations such as Ethiopia, Zambia, Kenya also face uncertainty with massive debts from China. Mr. Williams, could you speak to the global economic challenge that Chinese debts place on developing nations?
Thank you for the question, and I agree with your premise that this is a major concern and a major threat. And while I was in the National Security Council, we saw numerous instances where China would get a country knee-deep in debt, and then in exchange for that, in exchange for debt relief, would seize a strategic asset. And so that is a national security threat to the United States. One of the responses that we had in the Trump administration was the BUILD Act, which was intended to make the Development Finance Corporation much more robust in its ability to provide a meaningful alternative to China's investments. And I think so far, the track record on that agency in carrying out that strategic mission has been a little bit mixed. One of the things I talk about in my testimony is improvements that we can make at the DFC, ensuring that it has equity authority that can be used to make investments to countries instead of China, as well as looking at creating a program there similar to what we have at XM, which is the Transformational Exports Program, which cuts through some red tape and makes it easier for us to be strategic. So I think we need to look at DFC, we need to look at XM, and use both of those tools to provide an alternative. And then in the meantime, I talk a little bit about at the IMF and other places where we need to pressure China to restructure those debts for developing nations.
Continuing along on the discussion about the imperative of the U.S. being able to displace Chinese financing, would you expand a little bit more on the importance of the U.S. having a dependable export-import bank as an alternative to Chinese? We've had major discussion in recent years in this body over that very topic.
Absolutely. I think XM needs to play an increased role here. And if you look at the landscape internationally, and if you look at what China provides for its companies, and let's take telecom infrastructure as a good example. If you look at Huawei and companies like that, they're usually being sold at about a 30% discount to Western competitors. And it's very difficult for us, for countries to basically say, I'm going to pay 30% more. Even I hear you on the national security threat, but I'm still going to. So we need to have an alternative to that. And China's transformational CTEP, the China Transformational Export Program, is a good step forward. And I think the committee was right on with creating that. And I think that we need to further bolster XM to be an effective tool in that regard.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Yield back, Mr. Chair.